Like white soldiers in the Civil War, black soldiers experienced something they would never forget, a moment when, as Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, their hearts were touched with fire. But they fought more than just Confederate enemies. We'll come back and talk about what they faced with Richard Reed, author of Freedom for Themselves, North Carolina's Black Soldiers in the Civil War Era, on Civil War Talk Radio.
For the people in our military, it's a time of sacrifice and duty. That's why all 4 military aid societies have joined together to form the Armed Forces Relief Trust to help military families cope with financial and medical emergencies at home. With so many serving overseas, the need is greater than ever. You can learn more and donate at www.afrtrust.org. A message from the National Association of Broadcasters and this station.
Once upon a time, there lived 3 energy hogs. Now, an energy hog is what you have when humans waste energy. One day, the 3 energy hogs set out to find themselves a cottage.
Let's look for leaky windows,
said the first energy hog, for he knew that would waste energy.
Let's look for leaky doors,
said the second.
Let's look for a swing set,
said the third, for he had more blubber than brains. So they set off down the road. Presently, they came upon a tiny cottage where dwelled a clever girl named Dreadylocks.
I hope it has leaky windows,
cried the first energy hog.
I hope it has leaky doors,
cried the second.
I hope it has a bathroom,
cried the third, for only his brains were smaller than his bladder. But Dreadylocks liked playing cool games at energyhog.org, and from energyhog.org she learned how to use energy wisely. So the 3 energy hogs were forced to look elsewhere to waste energy, and had to use the disgusting restroom at the gas station down the road. And the moral of the story is, to use energy wisely, log on to energyhog.org, or waste not, hog not.
This public service message brought to you by the U.S. Department of Energy and the Ad Council.
World Talk Radio, bringing the world to you.
Welcome back to Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopovich, talking today with Richard M. Reed, author of Freedom for Themselves, North Carolina's Black Soldiers in the Civil War Era. In the first segment, we talked a little bit about the various topics really circling around black participation in the Civil War, but focusing now on what exactly brought, what characterizes the black military experience in North Carolina. Richard, one of the things that struck me about the way, as I was reading the first couple chapters of the book, was just how similar the black experience was in some aspects to the white military experience in terms of joining regiments and training and so forth.
Absolutely.
Is that fair?
Yes. I mean, I think that if you looked at 80 or 85 or 90% of the black military experience, it would resonate with white soldiers. You know, they had the same bad food, they had the same boring life interspersed with periods of fear, panic, exultation. They had the same discipline imposed on them. There were, however, the other 15 or 20% that set them apart, and it's trying to find this balance between what was unique to them and what was different. One little example, because I look at the soldiers in Reconstruction service, and you can find in the Reconstruction service, whether it's in Virginia or South Carolina or North Carolina, cases of violence between black soldiers and white citizens, or black soldiers and blacks and white soldiers. And that might be a manifestation of the racism that existed and the hostility towards black troops. But if you're looking through newspapers, you can also find cases of violence between white soldiers and white soldiers, and white soldiers and white civilians. And it's pulling out the different motivations in some of the incidents that you see that is intriguing and difficult for a historian.
So, it's too reductionist to say more similarities or more differences. Let's talk about
Let
this.
me put it this way, if I can. When we ended the last segment, I was saying what attracted me to dealing with a number of regiments, because in the book I deal with the 4 regiments. It seemed to me that the 4 regiments had within them enough variation that I could explore maybe 4 or 5 different issues in some depth. So things like the perception of their performance, or the question of atrocities, or the issue of dramatic social transformation that they seem to be symbolizing, or the condition of their families, or maybe the last, how as a historian do you make a mundane experience seem important to your readers? So those are the kind of issues that dealing with 4 regiments let me play with.
The 4 regiments did have remarkably different experiences among themselves, which I thought was one of the real strengths of this approach. Let's enlighten the listeners and just go over the 4 of them briefly, if you would.
Sure. When the first attempt to raise troops in North Carolina came out in part of interest in Massachusetts to set the wheels in motion that would allow black soldiers to prove their value. And so at the introduction of this topic, you talked about the 54th Massachusetts Glory Regiment. The sister regiment, the 55th Massachusetts, that's raised as the number of volunteers that came out of the north exceeded the numbers that could be used in the 1st regiment. The 55th regiment was, once it was staffed, sent to North Carolina to be part of what I would suggest was an experiment to demonstrate what black soldiers could do led by the proper white officers. So for the regiments that are, the first 3 regiments that are raised in North Carolina, there was an attempt to use Massachusetts white officers. Most were abolitionists in sentiment. Most were reformists, had some military experience, were temperance men. And Wilder begins this to raise this brigade in North Carolina to be a model that will show just how good the black soldier is. Well, events of the war overtake him. Before the regiment can be finished, it's pulled off into different areas, and by the time the 3rd regiment in that proposed brigade is raised, there are too many things going on to let them develop it the way that Wilde wished to, and it becomes very much like an average black regiment. So you can see in the first 3 an experiment initially begun that is never allowed to be completed. And in the last regiment I deal with, it's a heavy artillery regiment, and it's raised primarily for logistic reasons. Soldiers never fire a shot in anger. They spend their time in North Carolina very often as stevedores and laborers. And they are probably typical of how a lot of black regiments were used. But it's not very exciting stuff if you're a historian and you have to present this kind of a story, unless you can look for different ways to engage the reader.
That's true, certainly. One of the things I found myself wondering was how would you recruit people to serve in a regiment like that, but you described in some detail
And I think, I was thinking of this, that the regiment served a very useful service when you're reading about it, because what it does do, I think, is highlight what we often forget about, the degree to which there is black agency through this period. That if you're a young man young black man in New Bern, as you said, there were a number of possibilities as to what you could do. You could join early on a regiment like the 1st North Carolina, or what becomes the 35th USCT, which has an active campaign future ahead of it. Or you could remain as a citizen, a civilian rather, and take advantage of some of the work opportunity in Union-occupied eastern North Carolina, and some do. Or, and the artillery regiment represents the 3rd, you could join a regiment which was not likely to leave the state. You could be close to your family. You perhaps wouldn't risk the same threats that some of the fighting infantry regiments face. So it helps to remind us that the young black men had a range of choices, and they were making conscious decisions in where they would go and how they would serve. Decisions that were not always respected, mind you.
No, and indeed they were competed. There was competition for those recruits after the law was changed to allow draft quotas to be met for northern districts by agents traveling south and recruiting these people and having them count against the home district, so there wouldn't be a draft back, say, in Massachusetts. Well, one of the things also very interesting about this subject, and Joseph Glathar and others have explored this, is the relationship between the white officers of the units and the black enlisted men. Were there any black officers in any of these units?
Yes, but they weren't line officers. One of the things that Weil tries to do when he first staffs the regiment, and one of the things that made his brigade a little different, he comes in early enough that he gets the authority to select his own officers. He doesn't have to go through the Bureau of Colored Troops examination boards. And so in the 1st Regiment, he ensures that there is a black chaplain, and, more remarkable, that there is a black assistant surgeon, a man called John DeGrasse. Now, John DeGrasse ultimately is forced out. He's court-martialed for drunkenness. But it would seem that court-martial was as much about the color of his skin as it was about whether he drank. There were a few other black chaplains that are in this brigade, but DeGrasse is the only black surgeon. Now, there are never black officers in these 4 regiments serving as company officers. It's unlike, say, the 55th and 54th Massachusetts.
So I gather the issue of having black soldiers in positions of authority is something that the white army is not fully prepared for. What about non-commissioned officers?
Yes. Now, again, you can see a pattern change. The 1st regiment that is raised, all of the senior non-commissioned officers, so the 5 sergeants and the 8 corporals in the company, including the 1st sergeants, are all black. And that presented a problem for Wilder. Southern black regiments had an additional problem that northern black regiments probably didn't. In northern black regiments with free blacks from the north, you're far more likely to find people who were literate. And non-coms had a lot of responsibility for the filling out of forms, and so if they weren't literate, if they weren't willing and able to fill out the forms, it put extra onus on the officers. Well, the 2nd regiment that's raised has half a dozen white non-commissioned officers brought in to initially act either as senior sergeants or regimental sergeants. So there is a little bit of regression that way. But overwhelmingly, the officers, the non-commissioned officers in these 4 regiments are all black. Now, when you look carefully at the black non-commissioned officers, a high percentage of them have in the descriptive books comments such as mulatto, light brown. So these are non-commissioned officers who probably were among the mixed-race free blacks in North Carolina at the time of the war.
So the pattern changes over time, where you initially do have some black soldiers in positions of authority, and that diminishes. One of the things that I found reflected in all the chapters is how the intersection of military life and racial attitudes. The North is certainly almost as thickly encrusted with racial prejudice as the South at the time of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. But the pressures of military service, once you have black soldiers in the military, come into conflict with that. There's a constant tension that I saw in the experience of these regiments between the social norms of racial interaction and the needs of the military.
Yes, and one of the themes that I try to draw out through this book is that the treatment that the soldiers faced in the Army was in many ways a less unequal treatment than they had experienced in their civilian life or experienced from civilian society. Now, probably it was a greater difference for the Southern soldiers. They had grown up in a system where, to use one example, blacks could not testify in court against whites. And yet, and you can see this in say, the work of Christian Smido, under the military, blacks do have legal rights, can testify in their court-martials, can question white officers. So this is one example of the ways in which the Army has to be, if it's going to be efficient and function as well as it can, it has to be a colorblind institution. Now, having said that, all of the people trying to make it a colorblind institution are people who come into the Army, well, the overwhelming number of people come into the Army as civilians with all of the prejudice and social attitudes that Americans have in mid-19th century America. So there's constant tensions going on.
Well, this is a topic worth exploring. I want to pursue it a little further. Before we do that, we'll take another short break, and we'll come back and talk more with Richard Reed, author of Freedom for Themselves, North Carolina's Black Soldiers in the Civil War Era, on Civil War Talk Radio.